Okay. Behind it, tucked in slightly behind it, sternohyoid's been sort of peeled away here. And so behind it is another muscle that's coming from essentially the posterior aspect of the manubrium as well. But instead of going all the way up to the hyoid, it stops on the thyroid cartilage. So it goes about, I don't know, 4/5 of the way up, 3/4 of the way up. And so it obviously goes from sternothyroid, it goes from the manubrium all the way up to the thyroid cartilage on the front. And then essentially picking up where that one left off from the same line on the thyroid cartilage where the sternothyroid inserts, the thyroid hyoid originates and then goes up and inserts on the hyoid bone. So you can see the one that's going all the way up has to be in front, and then the ones behind sort of do the same thing in 2 steps. And they're pretty straightforward. They're easy enough to find. And you should be able to identify them and know them, even if there's only one left. Okay, once again, the digastric. Okay, these are called the suprahyoid muscles. Because whereas these others are below the hyoid, the infrahyoid, these are above the hyoid bone, and they're going up into, and generally up into the mandible in some form or other. So here's the posterior belly of the digastric, coming from the temporal bone back there, looping under this loop, this sling on the hyoid bone, and going up to the digastric fossa on the inner surface of the mandible. And then here on the midline, again, forming the floor of the mouth, which we will see again when we dissect the inside of the mouth, is this mylohyoid. Okay. It originates from a line, which we saw when we did the mandible, called the mylohyoid line on the mandible. And the one on each side, the one on the left comes down to the midline, the one on the right comes down towards the same midline, and they insert on this midline raphe or raphe, and then down below on the body of the hyoid. So these posterior fibers go into the hyoid, and the more anterior ones just went into the mylohyoid muscle on the other side. The same way that these anterior abdominal wall muscles came in from the side and then met their other side in the midline of the belly. And then coming in from the back, you won't see its origin today, but you can stick your finger up there and feel it. There is the stylohyoid, okay, which comes from the styloid process, that little protuberance that you saw coming out of the temporal bone in the back. Was broken off in many of your skulls, but it's really there. It comes down and inserts on the hyoid bone. And as it comes down, it's generally wrapped around the posterior belly of the digastric. So you have to sort of tease these fibers away back there to see the one that sort of goes into the tendon is the posterior belly of the digastric, and then the anterior belly comes out, and then the stylohyoid is usually wrapped around it, just going into the hyoid bone where it stops. Okay, so here's everything cut away, so you can see that styloid process coming out of the temporal bone there, and the stylohyoid comes off the tip of that little process, that long pointy thing, and goes down, wraps around the tendon of digastric, and inserts onto the body of the hyoid. Okay, so those are the muscles that you're going to be looking at today. You will also see some arteries today, and you will see some more arteries on Wednesday's dissection. Okay, so everything on each side obviously is coming from the common carotid, right? So when you have that arch of the aorta coming off or eventually forming was a common carotid, which is going to the head and neck, and then this is going to ultimately split into an internal carotid, which is just going straight up and in the underside of the skull through the carotid canal, and then we'll see it again when it pops out in the middle cranial fossa. And then the external carotid, which is obviously somewhere lateral to it, a little bit outside, which has lots and lots of branches, many of which you will see today, some you will see in the coming dissections. So the ones in order from bottom to top are superior thyroid, ascending pharyngeal, lingual artery, facial artery, occipital artery, posterior auricular artery, the maxillary artery, which we'll spend the whole day digging out, and then the superficial temporal arteries. And there are innumerable mnemonics at varying degrees of presentability for remembering the order of those in which they come out. Okay, so let's just start with the internal common carotid. There's the internal carotid. We won't see much of it today. It's always going to be there. The common carotid comes up, splits. The internal carotid has no branches, zooms all the way up into the base of the skull. You'll see it again in the head. The external carotid, there's a split here. The external carotid is out here on the side, and it's giving lots and lots of branches, many of which you should find in the course of today's dissection, and we will see them again in future dissections. So let's go over some of these. Okay, so this is roughly where we're dissecting today. Okay, so this first branch is called the superior thyroid for fairly obvious reasons. It comes out here at the bottom of the external carotid and goes down into the thyroid gland. Also sends a little branch that goes here into the larynx, which we'll see in a later dissection. Coming off and right where the external and internal carotids split, and going up the back of the throat, is a little branch known as the ascending pharyngeal, and it's often very, very difficult to find. Sometimes you find it later when we take the head off and flip it forward, but it's a very small thing lying on the back of the pharynx, or the throat. Coming off next up here a little higher is the lingual artery. Okay, and that's, as it implies, is going into the base of the tongue. So the tongue's lying down here under in the lower part of the mandible, and there's a lingual artery going straight in there. And you'll see it today, and you'll see it again when we dissect the tongue. Just above it is the facial artery, which comes out pretty much under the posterior part of the mandible, but then you can see here it flips up and runs along the front of the face, which we'll see in dissections later this week. Not infrequently, facial and lingual may have a common trunk here and then split into their two parts. Way up here, higher, is a big one called the maxillary artery, which goes into the infratemporal fossa here, and we'll spend the whole day digging branches of that out. You won't see it today. You might get a shot at it. Coming off to the back is the occipital artery, which, as the name implies, comes off the external carotid and then heads back towards the occiput. You remember right next to that digastric groove, there was a little groove here for the occipital artery, and then you saw the occipital artery in the first one of the dissections the first couple of days. Way higher, there's one called the posterior auricular that, as the name implies, is going behind the ear. You may see that when we do the maxillary artery. And then the last gasp of the external carotid is this superficial temporal, which again you'll find in sometime next week. The ones you have to worry about today: superior thyroid, maybe ascending pharyngeal, lingual, and facial, and maybe the occipital coming out. Okay, here's just essentially more of the same with a few more details in there. One of the interesting features that you can look for as a guide is, here's the superior thyroid, here's the lingual, here's the occipital artery, which comes up here and then flips back and heads to the back of the head. When it flips back, it goes over this hypoglossal nerve, which is going down into, as the name implies, under the tongue. So you can often identify the occipital artery because it loops over this nerve that you see coming down there. And in fact, the lingual artery usually goes in fairly near that nerve. So if you find that big nerve, which we'll talk about in a minute, it's intimately related to these two arteries. Taking pulses, because these arteries are going in different places and cross structures, right behind the angle of the mandible, you can usually feel the external carotid artery. Right where I said this facial artery comes under the mandible and then loops up over the body of the mandible to go up the side of the face. You can often feel the facial artery. And this last, after the maxillary artery comes off, as the superficial temporal comes up here, crosses the back of the zygomatic arch right in front of the external acoustic meatus, you can often get a pulse on the superficial temporal. Okay, obviously where there are arteries, there are veins. And as a rule of thumb, I think Dr. Larson pointed that out earlier, arteries, more often than not, do what they're supposed to do. Where you see them on their atlas, that's where they should be, with a few minor exceptions. Veins do what they want to do. There's obviously always a vein draining any region that's got blood in it, which is the whole body, but sometimes they can connect up in funny ways. So don't be surprised if your body doesn't show what the dissector says it should find. So here are the ones that you will see in the next couple of days. Obviously this big one, lying deep to sternocleidomastoids, sternocleidomastoids sort of coming down like this, covering it, is the internal jugular vein. Okay. Out here on the outside of sternocleidomastoid, was the external jugular vein, which some of you found, many of you didn't, which is no surprise, it happens a lot. Okay. Draining this area back up here on the side of the skull is a vein that then comes down behind the mandible, known as the retromandibular vein. Probably find that in a later dissection. And another little vein coming down from the area behind the ear, known as the postauricular vein. And then here there's a division. So part of the retromandibular may come down and go into the internal jugular. Part of it may have a split out here and go into the external jugular. And then part of it can come down and come forward, where the facial vein comes down the side of the face. We'll see that in a later dissection. And then there's a multiple junction. There's a common facial vein that dumps into the internal jugular, and part of the retromandibular can go into that. Ultimately, they're all going to end up in these brachiocephalic veins and into the superior vena cava. Okay? There are a couple of veins that aren't labeled here. There's an anterior jugular right there, and then a whole series of little veins around the mandible. So obviously you'll find the internal jugular. It's in the carotid sheath. You may or may not have found the external jugular, but there's one on the prosection, so make sure you know where it is. We'll see many of these later. You'll see the facial vein when we dissect the face, and you'll see other veins in your dissection. Let's go into a little bit greater detail. So as I said, here's your internal jugular. Here's your facial vein coming back, going into internal jugular. Here's the anterior division of the retromandibular that you dump into it. The posterior division going into the external jugular. Okay, just the same thing we just saw. Posterior auricular back there. Okay, so let's go into even more detail of these guys with some other structures. So when we get to the face, Friday is face. Okay, so here's our facial artery coming out here, going up the side of the face, just behind the corner of the mouth, and then it's going to zoom up, sending branches to the lips. There are labial branches going to the lips, and then it ends up going up the side of the nose there. Poking out under the back of the mandible is something called the submandibular salivary gland, which takes up a lot of space, and you need to essentially remove it to find all the structures underneath there. And there's the facial vein basically backtracking along the root of the facial artery. The facial artery is usually in front. The vein's a much straighter structure that zips down and then dives in back there. Here's the parotid gland, which we'll dissect in several sections later, and some of these structures are going deep to that. In more gory detail. Okay. So here's our internal jugular again. Here's our external jugular on the outside. Sternocleidomastoid is between these two. Here's the facial vein coming down from the side of the face, going over the side of the mandible, right, and then joining part of the retromandibular, becoming the common facial vein, which dumps into the internal jugular. Here's an anterior jugular, which runs right along the front of the neck. Okay, and then there's often this other thing called a communicating branch, which can join this common facial down to here, join into that before they all dump into the subclavian up here, or can go into the external jugular. There's all sorts of ways in which these guys can come together, but you identify them by basically their position. This line right here along the midline is the anterior jugular. If it's a little deep, more posterior to that, it's one of these communicating branches. The external, like I say, is out here on the outside of sternocleidomastoid, and the internal jugular is impossible to miss. More of the same. External jugular on the side from a different view. Anterior jugular running right near the midline. One of these communicating branches, sort of splitting the difference. And then they all end up deep in here, the structures we're going to dissect tomorrow on Wednesday, the root of the neck. In the anterior triangle, you basically got these anterior jugular and these communicating branches. And deep in that side of that carotid sheath is the internal jugular. Okay? So way over here in the corner, right where the facial vein comes down from the side of the mandible, the anterior part of the retromandibular comes down here, and then the common facial can get back into there. And they're all going to end up in this internal jugular.